Gugulethu stood on the balcony of her home, sipping a glass of wine as the sun set over the city. The golden hues painted the sky in a breathtaking masterpiece, but her mind was elsewhere. Her son, Onyeka, had invited his best friend, Onyeka, over for dinner. She had known Onyeka since he was a boy, but recently, she had started noticing him in a way she never had before. He had grown into a strikingly handsome young man, tall, strong, with deep brown skin that glowed under the evening light. His laughter was rich, his presence commanding, and his confidence undeniable. It was wrong to think of him like this. She was a grown woman, old enough to be his mother. But something about Onyeka's presence unsettled her. Inside, the aroma of slow-cooked stew filled the air. Onyeka and Onyeka sat at the dining table, laughing over an inside joke. Gugulethu placed a bowl in front of Onyeka, and as she did, his fingers lightly brushed against hers. A spark shot up her spine, and she quickly withdrew her hand. "You always make the best food, Mama Gugu," Onyeka said, his deep voice laced with something unspoken. She smiled, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Thank you, Onyeka. Eat before it gets cold." Throughout the dinner, Onyeka's gaze lingered on her. It wasn't the look of a boy admiring a maternal figure. No, it was something deeper, something more dangerous. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the way he had looked at her. The way his lips curled into a smile. The way his voice dipped when he spoke to her. This was madness. But it had begun. The next morning, the house was alive with the sound of laughter. Onyeka and Onyeka were in the backyard, tossing a football back and forth. Gugulethu watched them from the kitchen window, her heart pounding as Onyeka removed his shirt, revealing his toned chest glistening with sweat. She knew she should look away. She knew she should stop this before it spiraled out of control. But the way his muscles flexed, the confidence in his stance, it was impossible to ignore. "Ma, do we have more juice?" Onyeka called, snapping her out of her trance. "Yes, in the fridge," she replied, shaking off the heat rising in her body. Minutes later, Onyeka walked into the kitchen, his presence overwhelming in the small space. He was still shirtless, his skin radiating warmth. He grabbed a glass, filling it with juice, but his eyes never left hers. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice smooth, teasing. "I'm just tired," she lied. Onyeka leaned against the counter, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "Or maybe you're avoiding me." Her breath hitched. "Why would I avoid you?" "Because you feel it too." Gugulethu's stomach tightened. Onyeka. Before she could finish, the door swung open, and Onyeka walked in, oblivious to the tension thick in the air. That evening, Gugulethu tried to keep her distance, but Onyeka was relentless. Every glance, every subtle brush of his fingers against hers sent fire through her veins. Late at night, after everyone had gone to bed, Gugulethu stepped out onto the balcony for fresh air. She needed to clear her mind. But Onyeka was there, leaning against the railing, waiting. "You can't keep running from this," he murmured, stepping closer. "This is wrong," she whispered, but she didn't move away. "Then why does it feel so right?" And before she could protest, before she could remind herself of all the reasons this was forbidden, his lips were on hers, hot, insistent, and full of desire. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to melt into him, her body betraying her. But reality came crashing down, and she pulled away, her breath ragged. "I can't," she gasped, turning and rushing inside. But the damage was already done. The line had been crossed. Gugulethu lay awake in bed, her body trembling from what had just happened. The taste of Onyeka still lingered on her lips, her heart pounding with the weight of her actions. This was madness. She turned onto her side, squeezing her eyes shut, willing the heat between her legs to disappear. But it wouldn't. Days passed, and she did everything in her power to avoid him. Onyeka noticed her sudden coldness towards Aynd, but she made excuses. She was busy, she was tired, she had work. Anything to keep herself from being alone with him again. But fate had other plans. One evening, Onyeka and Ugochi had plans to go out, leaving Aynd and Gugulethu alone in the house. The tension had been building between them for days, the silence thick with unspoken words. She was in the kitchen, preparing tea, when she felt his presence behind her. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low. She inhaled sharply. "I don't know what you mean." Aynd stepped closer, until his body was nearly pressed against hers. "You do." Gugulethu turned to face him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "This has to stop, Aynd." "Why?" He leaned in, his voice like silk. "Because you're scared of what you feel." She swallowed hard. "Because it's wrong." He reached out, his fingers trailing up her arm, leaving goosebumps in their wake. "Then tell me to stop." But she couldn't. Aynd took her silence as permission. His lips crushed against hers, his hands roaming her body with a hunger that sent fire coursing through her veins. She moaned into his mouth, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pressed herself against him. She had never felt this way before. Not even with Onyeka's father. This was reckless, raw, and all-consuming. Aynd lifted her onto the counter, his hands gripping her thighs, pulling her closer. "I've wanted this for so long," he groaned against her neck. She gasped as his lips trailed down her throat, her body arching into him. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice screamed at her to stop. But she silenced it. Tonight, she wouldn't think about the consequences. Tonight, she would surrender. The morning after their passionate encounter, Gugulethu awoke to golden sunlight streaming through her curtains. Her body still tingled with the memory of Aynd's touch, but as soon as she opened her eyes, reality crashed down on her like a storm. What had she done? She sat up in bed, pulling the sheets around her, her heart pounding in her chest. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Onyeka's best friend. A young man who trusted her, who looked at her with a kind of reverence that she had let consume her. Her hands trembled as she got out of bed and wrapped herself in a robe. She needed to face him. She needed to end this before it spiraled any further. As she stepped out into the hallway, she heard movement in the kitchen. Her breath caught as she saw Aynd standing at the counter, shirtless, casually sipping a cup of coffee as if nothing had changed. He turned when he sensed her, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "Morning," he said, his voice husky. She swallowed hard. "Aynd, we need to talk." He set the cup down and walked toward her, closing the distance between them in a few strides. "We talked last night," he murmured, reaching for her waist. She stepped back, shaking her head. "No, that was a mistake. We can't do this." "Onyeka doesn't know," Aynd finished for her. His dark eyes studied her face. "And he doesn't have to." Gugulethu felt her resolve waver at the way he looked at her, his confidence so intoxicating. But deep down, she knew this couldn't continue. Before she could respond, the front door swung open, and Onyeka's voice filled the house. "Aynd." "Ma." Panic shot through Gugulethu as Aynd smirked and leaned in close. "Think about what you really want," he whispered before stepping back just as Onyeka entered the room. Oblivious to the tension, Onyeka grinned at them. "What's up, guys?" Gugulethu forced a smile, her heart pounding. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just making coffee." But as Onyeka chatted about his night out, she could feel Aynd's eyes on her, the heat of his presence lingering like a dangerous secret. She had let herself get lost in the fire. Now, she had to find a way to escape before it consumed her completely. Days passed, and Gugulethu tried to move on, but the fire between her and Aynd refused to die. It lingered in stolen glances, in accidental touches that set her skin ablaze, in the way his voice dropped just a little lower when he spoke to her. She knew she had to end this. But how could she, when every moment without him felt like torture? Aind, however, was relentless. He didn't beg or plead, didn't push too hard, but he was always there, watching her, waiting. It was the waiting that terrified her the most, because deep down, she knew she was waiting too. One evening, Onyeka and Ugochi made plans to go out again, leaving her and Aind alone. She told herself this was her chance to set things right. She needed to make him understand that they had to stop, that this could never happen again. But Aind had other plans. As soon as the door closed behind Onyeka, he moved closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Gugu," he murmured, his voice like velvet. "Don't," she whispered, stepping back. "Don't what?" His dark eyes searched hers, and she could see the amusement there, the challenge. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "Then tell me you don't want me," he said, his voice low. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because it would be a lie. Aind took another step forward, and she had nowhere left to run. "You don't have to fight this," he whispered. "We both know it's real." Her heart pounded. She should push him away. She should tell him to leave. But when his fingers brushed against her arm, she shivered. And then, there was a knock at the door. She gasped, stepping away from him, her breath coming in shallow bursts. "Expecting someone?" Aind asked, his voice still smooth, but his jaw clenched. She shook her head, trying to calm the storm inside her as she hurried to the door. When she opened it, she froze. Onyeka. Her son stood there, eyes dark with something she couldn't quite read. Behind him, Ugochi lingered, awkwardly shifting her weight. "Onyeka," she said, forcing a smile. "I thought you were staying out late." His eyes flickered past her, landing on Aind. Then, slowly, they returned to her. "We forgot something," he said, his voice flat. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Gugulethu felt the walls closing in around her. Did he suspect something? Had he seen something? "Right," she said, stepping aside as Onyeka walked past her. Aind stood there, arms crossed, but his usual confidence was gone. Onyeka grabbed his phone from the counter, then turned to Aind. "You coming?" Gugulethu held her breath. Aind looked at her, just for a second, then nodded. "Yeah. Let's go." She exhaled, relief washing over her. But as Onyeka walked out, he paused at the door and glanced back at her. This time, she knew exactly what was in his eyes. Disappointment. He knew. And in that moment, Gugulethu realized something. The passion, the heat, the stolen moments, they had all been a fantasy. But this? This was real. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. And the worst part? She wasn't sure she regretted it.